Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, famed leftist icon Noam Chomsky started trending on social media after he upset liberals for saying Ukraine should negotiate with Russia rather than fight in a bloody war. Noam first sat down with Nathan J. Robinson from Current Affairs, where he said, quote, "In this world, there are two options with regard to Ukraine. As we know, one option is a negotiated settlement, which will offer Putin an escape, an ugly settlement. Is it within reach? We don't know. You can only find out by trying, and we're refusing to try, but that's one option. The other option is to make it explicit and clear to Putin and the small circle of men around him that you have no escape. You're going to go to war crimes trial no matter what you do. Boris Johnson just reiterated this. Sanctions will go on no matter what you do." What does that mean? It means go ahead and obliterate Ukraine and go on to lay the basis for a terminal war. Those are the two options, and we're picking the second and praising ourselves for heroism and doing it, fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. He reiterated these sentiments while talking with Jeremy Scahill from The Intercept.
The right question is, what is the best thing to do to save Ukraine from a grim fate, from further destruction? And that's to move towards a negotiated settlement. There are some simple facts that aren't really controversial. There are two ways for a war to end. One way is for one side or the other to be basically destroyed, and the Russians are not going to be destroyed. So that means one way is for Ukraine to be destroyed. The other way is some negotiated settlement. If there's a third way, no one's ever figured it out. So what we should be doing is devoting all the things you mentioned, if properly shaped, but primarily moving towards a possible negotiated settlement that will save Ukrainians from further disaster.
Now, in both interviews, he quotes respected veteran diplomat and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense Chaz Freeman, who said the U.S.'s policy is not to negotiate, but to fight to the last Ukrainian. Chomsky said in his interview with Current Affairs, "I don't know if you saw it, but a couple of days ago, there was a very important interview by one of the most astute and respected figures in current U.S. diplomatic circles, Ambassador Chaz Freeman, a very important interview. He pointed out that the current U.S. policy, which he bitterly criticized, is to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, and he gave us an example. President Biden's heroic statement about the war criminal Putin, Biden's counterpart, as a war criminal. And Freeman pointed out the obvious. The U.S. is setting things up so as to destroy Ukraine and lead to a terminal war." Well, the very important interview Noam Chomsky is referring to is one in which Chaz Freeman sat down with Aaron Mate from the Gray Zone back in late March.
But we don't know where this is going, and more to the point, the United States is not part of any effort to negotiate an end to the fighting. To the extent that there is mediation going on, it seems to be by Turkey, possibly Israel, maybe China, and that's about it. The United States is not in the room. Everything we are doing, rather than accelerating an end to the fighting and some compromise, seems to be aimed at prolonging the fighting, assisting the Ukrainian resistance, which is a noble cause, I suppose, but it will result in a lot of dead Ukrainians as well as dead Russians. Zelensky is obviously a very intelligent man, and he saw what the consequences of being put in what he called limbo would be. Namely, Ukraine would be hung out to dry. And the West was basically saying, we will fight to the last Ukrainian for Ukrainian independence, which essentially remains our stand. It's pretty cynical.
Chaz Freeman also talks about something Chomsky is experiencing right now, being labeled a Putin puppet for calling for peace.
I know people who have been attempted to be objective about this, and they're immediately accused of being Russian agents, or that is to say, the price of speaking on this subject is to join the pom-pom girls in a frenzy of support for our position. And if you're not part of the chorus, you're not allowed to say anything, and you can't sing. So I think that this has had very injurious effects on Western liberties. And it has enforced an almost, I won't say it's totalitarian, but it's certainly similar kind of control on freedom of expression and inquiry in the West. It's very depressing, really.
So Ryan and Robbie, I mean, there's definitely a problem here, that Chaz Freeman, I think, is bringing up of, if you say anything other than just fight until the last Ukrainian, then you're labeled a Putin puppet. But one thing Noam said in his interviews is there's a difference between being rational and being humane. And he says, you might think it's rational for Ukraine to continue fighting. Like, for example, of course, they have the right to defend themselves. No one is saying they don't have that right. Do they have a right to American and Western weapons and, constant stream of weaponry? That's a discussion to have. But they absolutely have the right to defend themselves. But what is humane for the Ukrainian people? That is a bigger question in this battle. And so, but it's interesting that Noam Chomsky is just getting eviscerated. It just kind of shows me that there's so much about what is traditionally liberal values that seem to have just been, they're just deteriorating. Just free, lack censorship. Right now, you've got so many liberals championing censorship. You have liberals championing big tech and big pharma. And now even the military-industrial complex just saying, yeah, we need more war, more war, more war. So it's like amazing to me, this kind of transformation that's been happening over the years. But, Ryan, what is your take on Noam getting dragged for calling for peace and saying this is the realistic option is you're just going to have to give Russia something, like it or not, if you don't want to destroy Ukraine?
Right, it's kind of delusional, and it's actually why I asked Jen Psaki that question in the press room a couple of weeks ago. That said, what is the U.S. doing to push negotiations toward a settlement forward? Well, what is the U.S. doing? And her answer was, well, we're the largest provider of weapons and also humanitarian aid, and that does seem to be the U.S. strategy here, that they're going to somehow get to a settlement by continuing this war and continuing to keep Ukraine in the fight, which I think can make sense in the very beginning, but it's now quickly moving into a almost endless war type of situation and fitting in with a new strategy that the U.S. is developing toward Russia. And the Washington Post reported over the weekend, it said the Biden administration and its European allies have begun planning for a far different world in which they no longer try to coexist and cooperate with Russia, but actively seek to isolate and weaken it as a matter of long-term strategy. And one of the ways to isolate and weaken a country is to keep it in a kind of low-grade war in eastern Ukraine endlessly.
Yeah, I was surprised to see Chomsky getting criticized so hard for those remarks. And I don't necessarily, agree with Chomsky probably as much as you do, Ryan, and maybe you, Kim, I don't know, probably on the foreign policy questions. So I might have criticized him for something he would say about this, but I thought what he said was perfectly in keeping with, kind of the discussion we've all had on this show along the lines of, what you just outlined. But yes, they have the right to defend themselves. Yes, ideally we want them to, we want Russia to desist from this war, but us just wanting that is not going to make it happen. So what can we, what is actually going to make it happen? What is actually going to bring this to a peaceful resolution? Obviously a resolution that not everyone is completely happy with, that I'm not completely happy with as someone who wants, Ukraine to keep all its territory. And I want Russia, the authoritarian government of Russia, totally defeated and humiliated, but that's just not realistic. So what is realistic? And we have to be willing to have that conversation, and our government has to be willing to work toward that. And they give some indication that, like you said, Ryan, they're looking for something more, something longer, something that will leave a lot more Ukrainians dead.
Well, and one thing Noam even said in his interviews is he talked about the Brzezinski plan. Brian, I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but he mentioned that Hillary Clinton actually brought it up just the other day, saying that, praising the fact that the U.S. was able to bait Russia into a war in Afghanistan and then continued the war forever, prolonged it by arming and training the rebels, which we all know, the Mujahideen, which we all know then eventually became, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And so she was actually saying, well, we did it once and this Brzezinski plan was great. And so we're basically championing the idea of doing it again in Ukraine, which is, and then he quoted somebody, I forgot who it was, another official who said, well, it's not about, it isn't about the Afghan lives, for example, when he's talking about Afghanistan. He says this is about hobbling a world power from expanding. So you have to kind of pick and choose which one's more important to you. And he was essentially saying it's more important to us to hobble the Soviets at the time than it is who cares about Afghan lives. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing here. And by the way, that Chaz Freeman interview was back in mid-March. I think it was like the 22nd or 23rd of March when he said that. And he said, look, the U.S.'s plan is just to continue this war and keep supplying weapons. And we've seen now, 3 weeks later, that's absolutely the case. We've still been doing that. There hasn't been any real true attempt at a negotiation. It has been Turkey. It has been Israel. Has even been China, other countries. And so, Americans, I think, as a public, need to get together and ask, are we really, do we just not care about human life at all? Are we just like, whatever, fight it out, like gladiator style until one of you is dead? And we know which one that's going to be. But I guess it'll weaken Russia for the next however many years. I mean, it's very, it's a depressing situation.
If the American policy really was to just prolong this war in order to weaken Russia and to not, and to make it very difficult to reach a settlement, what they're doing now is what they would do. Like they would say, hey, if this war ends, we're going to keep the sanctions on. They would say, hey, when this war is over, you're going to be prosecuted as a war criminal. And keep funneling weapons in the meantime. Like if your strategy was to make sure that the war lasted as long as it possibly could, that's precisely what you would do. So if that's not their strategy, then they're going about it completely wrong. The only explanation to me, given that they're not complete idiots, is that they're getting what they want out of this.
Yeah, so America needs to kind of understand we traded wars now. We traded Afghanistan for Ukraine. The only difference is at this point, which could change, we don't have troops in Ukraine as we did in Afghanistan.
And the other difference, key, is that we're risking nuclear annihilation this time.
And then there's that, right. Yeah, so it might even be
small
worse.
Detail.
But
Small
we were
detail.
Right, yeah. But we, yeah. Well, anyway, thank you for that, Kim. We'll have more Rising right after this.